господин председатель.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, today we are witnessing historic events. Not every generation gets a chance to see them. In front of our eyes, the multipolar world is taking its outlines. The world that should have come into being 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War, which put a line under the ideological confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West. At the time, the world was full of hope for a better future, hope for cooperation between key actors for the interests of the whole mankind, ending of world, and creating a new indivisible system of security where former foes would become allies and we work on international problems together. Unfortunately, at the time, that logic did not come to the fore, and the ideology of cooperation was gradually replaced by the philosophy of the zero-sum game. This was not our choice, and we have warned many a time about the dangers this kind of logic contains within itself. As a result, the world ended up on the brink of a third world war because of what the Western countries are doing, namely the anti-Russian project called Ukraine, which is taking place at our borders. Its key milestone was the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in February 2014, as a result of which, with Western assistance, a loud minority came to power. And this minority has the ideals of extreme nationalism and Russophobia. It is intolerant to a different opinion, to everything Russian, to the canonical Orthodox faith. It glorifies the accomplices of Hitler's executioners who, during the World War II, killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians. This regime launched a brutal war against their Russian compatriots in the eastern of the country, trying to eliminate their identity and replace them with the ideals of an all-out Ukrainian nationalism. This way, Ukraine itself launched the mechanism of a self-destruction by hatred, intolerance. This could have stopped by the Minsk agreements, which were endorsed by the Security Council 10 years ago exactly. But instead of implementing them, the Kiev regime, with the patronage of the Western sponsors, decided, as we all know today, decided to undermine the agreements and at the same time arming itself and preparing for a war with Russia. The citizens of Ukraine tried to stop these mechanisms again when 3/4 of them in May 2019 voted for the new Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, who promised peace on the eastern part of the country, promised to protect the Russian language and the rights of the Russian-speaking citizens, promised to end the glorification of Nazi accomplices, and to restore good neighborly relations with Russia. Unfortunately, when he became president, he treacherously turned the country back to its earlier suicidal and inhumane course. All this time, Russia, on its part, showed patience, restraints, did not give in to the provocations from Kiev and its Western sponsors. And we kept stating very clearly at the same time that we were not going to give up on the Russian people. We will not allow them to be persecuted or to have their identity changed. There was another red line for us, and that was Ukraine's membership in NATO. That created an unacceptable military strategic risks for Russia. And we're trying to sort it out peacefully with Kiev and Washington and Brussels. No one listened to us, no one took us seriously. And it was only when 3 years ago it became absolutely clear that both of the red lines were going to imminently crossed by Ukraine, we had to start the special military operation, stating clearly what its goals were. From the very first day of the operation at the same time, we kept talking that we stand ready to arrive at the special military operations goals through peaceful means, and that, in fact, that would be our preference. Today, the Kiev regime is on the brink of a crushing military defeat and continues sacrificing tens of thousands of Ukrainian people and women. Most of them have to be mobilized by force. For Zelensky and his clique, who usurped power and who refused in May last year to conduct elections in violation of Ukraine's constitution, they find it's unacceptable to have any talk about peace unless they're on the basis of the ultimatum and the provisions from the Zelensky formula, which has no bearing, no relation with what's happening on the battlefield. Maniacal thrust to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia and egged on by some Western sponsors, the UK first and foremost, this former actor rejected the Istanbul agreements in April 2022, which had already been initiated, and also passed a law banning himself and his colleagues to have a negotiation with Russian authorities. Over the past 3 years, Ukraine received hundreds of billions of dollars of support. The country kept receiving weapons and mercenaries and intelligence data. In other words, Ukraine became a private military company of sorts, fighting for Western geopolitical interests. Become a classic proxy war by Russia against the countries of NATO. Despite that, the Ukrainian army suffered catastrophic losses, and the capitulation of the Kiev regime is a matter of time. And we have said this many times, including this hall. Trying to drag the Western countries at any cost in confrontation with Russia. In August of last year, Zelensky started a suicidal aggression against a peaceful Russian region in the Kursk Oblast. As a result, as we know today from witnesses and Ukrainian soldiers who were captured, hundreds of peaceful citizens were killed and tortured. And the Ukrainian occupiers were involved in looting, violence, and pillaging. The expectation was that Russia was going to react to this equally brutally, and the public opinion will once again take the side of Kiev. This similarly to what was being done by the crude provocation in Bucha, whose investigation, by the way, is being slow-walked by the Kiev regime. The Kursk misadventure of Zelensky, as you know, was futile. It only accelerated the collapse on the Eastern Front, where Ukraine is lacking resources. They're all being burned in the Kursk Oblast. Today, the Ukrainian army controls little more than 1/3 of the original territory there and is suffering horrifying. In parallel to that, the Russian army is moving forward in Donbass, Zaporozhskaya, and Kherson Oblast, the oblast which became part of Russia in the fall of 2022 as a result of a referendum. Every day we learn new names of liberated places and, unfortunately, new horrifying figures of Ukrainian army losses or other cannon fodder, which Zelensky turned it into. The new regions of Russia are seeing hundreds of thousands of people arriving from Ukraine, and this disproves the Ukrainian propaganda statement that people, their people hate the Russians. When we've stated this clearly, we're not fighting for territories, we're fighting for people. As we all know, the hopelessness of Zelensky regime recently have become obvious also to the main sponsor of the Kiev junta, the United States. The Republican administration, led by President Trump, finally saw the real face of the expired Ukrainian president and realized that he is not at all interested in having peace in this country because he's clinging to power with everything that he has, is fearful of democratic elections where he has no chance of winning. He's not interested in anything else, and he's ready to sacrifice the entire people of Ukraine and its natural resource in order to hold on to his power. Information starting up to the fore about the unfortunate corruption in Ukraine, which has blossomed under Zelensky, stealing of Western assistance and the reselling on the black market of weapons supplies, hundreds of billions of dollars worth, and the blood-curdling instances of human rights violations, for which the Ukrainians nicknamed their country the Zelensky concentration camp. The number of those who want to leave the Ukraine in order to avoid prosecution and avoid going to the front is extraordinarily high, but the Kiev potentate does not allow people from the country. It's clear that under these conditions where we have in Kiev a former comedian is very worried by direct negotiations, direct talks between Russia and the United States about the means of settling the Ukrainian crisis and removing the reasons which led to its existence, which would drastically improve the international situation. The European countries are also worried by that. They have spent years helping the Kiev clique and covered its crimes, and they nurtured Russophobia. They try to ignore the fact that the wind has changed and there is a clear demand for peace now. And the impediment to that is the Kiev usurper and its accomplices. They're not at the rudder anymore, but these pathetic peacekeepers are at a loss, but do continue to lecture the rest of the world about how we're supposed to live in this beautiful garden. Colleagues, the draft by EU and Ukraine today is directly related to this bubble. It is slapped together by this grouping which is trying to ignore realities on the ground on the one hand and include into the key elements from the Zelensky formula, the failed Bergenstock process, and on the other hand trying to cover it up at the same time, round it off to make sure that the countries of the global south do not see such unpleasant undertakings. They are very interested in figures today to present them as support of the Kiev regime and prolong its agony for some time. But it will be the everyday Ukrainians who will pay for this with their lives. Think about this. Many of us are asked us about what would be the right way to vote, choosing between the two texts, the EU-Ukrainian text and the American text. Well, everyone who's going to press the button during the voting process today has the chance. You either play along with Zelensky and his sponsors and support their incantations, which are divorced of realities, or make a choice in favor of practical, realistic steps which can stop the hostilities in Ukraine in the very near future. Don't get deceived and make the right choice here. The second draft resolution was submitted by our American colleagues, and this text is, of course, a step in the right direction. To make sure that this initiative is fully in line with the understandings arrived at during the Russian and American context at the highest and high levels, we introduced an amendment to that about the need to eliminate the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. And this, by the way, was mentioned by President Trump several times. This would help with its lasting settlement, as is proposed by the United States in their text. And we expect, we trust that hope for the support of all sensible delegations in this room. As regards the amendments from some states of the European Union, amendments to the American text, well, they clearly replace the essence of that text. If they were to pass, then we will have, instead of something that's full of common sense, we will have an ultimatum in the spirit of the Bergenstock process, and it will distance the settlement of the conflict away from us, and will be not different from politicized products during this emergency special sessions. We shall be voting against them and urge all member states to do the same.